On the morning of November 3rd, 1845, the parishioners of St. Brigid's Church in Monaghan Town, Ireland, found their priest sprawled beneath the altar, his cassock stained dark and stiff. Father Declan O'Malley's face had frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his mouth open as if caught mid-scream. His skin possessed an unnatural pallor, waxy, almost translucent in the dim morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. But it was the wounds that stopped the first witness, young altar boy Thomas Brennan, in his tracks. 2 puncture marks on the father's neck. His body drained so completely of blood that the local physician, Dr. James Whitmore, would later write in his report, "I have attended to battlefield casualties with more color in their veins than this poor soul possessed." Above them, in the church, rafters, hundreds of bats stirred in their slumber, their collective breathing creating a rhythm like whispered prayers. The village elders would quickly declare it an accident. Perhaps the aging priest had fallen and struck his neck on something sharp. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in that God-fearing Irish community could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Monaghan church bats, the 1845 priest found Exsanguinated with hundreds of bats nesting in the church rafters, a case that would grip Ireland in vampire folklore hysteria. Make sure to subscribe to The Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into history's darkest corners, and your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers spanning the globe. Now let's step back into the Ireland of 1845, where faith and fear walked hand in hand through the streets of Monaghan Town. Ireland in 1845 stood on the precipice of catastrophe. The Great Famine had just begun its devastating march across the island, though few recognized it yet. In September of that year, the potato blight had first appeared, a strange black rot that could destroy an entire field overnight. By November, when Father O'Malley met his end, whispers of starvation had begun circulating through the countryside like a plague of their own. Monaghan Town, situated in Ulster's rolling hills near the border with what would become Northern Ireland, had always existed in a peculiar space between the old world and the new. The town of roughly 3,000 souls served as a market hub for the surrounding agricultural communities. Stone buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their Georgian facades speaking to a prosperity that would soon evaporate like morning mist. The Protestant ascendancy maintained firm control over land and politics, though the Catholic majority comprised most of the population, a tension that simmered beneath every social interaction. St. Brigid's Church had anchored the Catholic community for over 2 centuries. Built in 1632, the stone structure featured the cruciform layout typical of Irish Catholic churches, with a bell tower that dominated the skyline. The interior boasted high vaulted ceilings, exposed oak beams, and narrow lancet windows that never quite admitted enough light, leaving the nave perpetually shrouded in a somber dimness. The church could accommodate nearly 400 worshippers during Sunday Mass, packed shoulder to shoulder in the wooden pews that had been worn smooth by generations of prayer. Father Declan O'Malley had served St. Brigid's for 18 years, arriving in 1827 as a young priest fresh from seminary in Dublin. At 41 years old, he was considered a pillar of the community, stern but fair, devoted to his parishioners, known for his lengthy sermons about sin and redemption. His housekeeper, Mrs. Siobhan Kearney, a widow of 50 years, maintained his modest residence adjacent to the church grounds. She would later testify that Father O'Malley had seemed increasingly troubled in the weeks before his death, though she attributed it to worry over the failing crops. He barely touched his supper those last days, Mrs. Kearney told the local magistrate. Said his appetite had fled. He'd taken to spending his nights in the church, praying before the altar for God to spare us from the hunger that was coming. Sometimes I'd hear him through the walls, his voice raised in what sounded like arguments, though he was alone. Or so I believed. The bats had always been present in St. Brigid's. Ireland hosted several native bat species, the common pipistrelle, the brown long-eared, the lesser horseshoe, and old churches with their abundant roosting spaces and insect populations provided ideal habitats. Most parishioners barely noticed them, accepting their presence as simply another feature of the ancient building, like the musty smell of old stone, or the perpetual draft that no amount of repair could quite eliminate. But something had changed that autumn. Where once perhaps a dozen bats might have roosted in the rafters, their numbers had swelled dramatically. Parishioners began complaining about the increased droppings, the unsettling rustle of wings during evening mass, the way the bats seemed more active even during daylight hours. Father O'Malley had dismissed these concerns, insisting that God's creatures deserved shelter. that the bats harmed no one and in fact served a useful purpose by consuming insects. "They're drawn to holy places," he'd said in late October, his words recorded in the diary of merchant Patrick Gallagher. "They seek sanctuary just as we all do." Yet those who looked closely might have noticed other changes in their priest. Father O'Malley had grown paler, more withdrawn. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes, giving him a hollow, haunted appearance. He'd begun wearing his collar buttoned to the very top, even during warm days, and would flinch when parishioners approached him too suddenly. During confession, several villagers reported that his hands trembled as he granted absolution, and his voice would sometimes drop to a whisper mid-prayer, as if he'd forgotten the words he'd spoken thousands of times before. The church registry shows that Father O'Malley had stopped recording marriages and baptisms after October 15th, leaving several weeks of blank pages, an unprecedented lapse for a man known for his meticulous record-keeping. The last entry in his personal journal, dated October 28th and discovered later among his effects, consisted of a single line written in an increasingly erratic hand. "They come to me in dreams now, and I fear the dreams are bleeding into waking. God forgive me, but I cannot tell which is which anymore." The first incident that truly alarmed the community occurred on October 18, 1845, during evening vespers. Mary Doyle, a farmer's wife known for her steady temperament, was kneeling in prayer when she felt something warm drip onto her folded hands. Looking up, she saw dark stains spreading across the church's vaulted ceiling, spreading despite the fact that it hadn't rained in 3 days. When maintenance worker Liam Murphy climbed into the rafters the next morning to investigate, he discovered the source. The bat colony, now numbering in the hundreds, had created such massive accumulations of guano that it had begun seeping through the ancient wood. But more disturbing were the dead pigeons he found, at least a dozen of them, drained of blood, their bodies positioned in almost ritualistic arrangements. Murphy, an otherwise unimaginative man, described feeling watched as he worked, though every time he turned, he saw only the clustered bats hanging motionless from the beams. "Their eyes," he told his wife that evening, his own eyes wide and unfocused. "They were all looking at me. Bats don't do that, they sleep during the day, but these, they were watching." Mrs. Kearney reported the second incident to the magistrate after Father O'Malley's deed. She'd woken on the night of October 23rd to sounds of struggle coming from the church. Throwing a shawl over her nightdress, she'd hurried across the courtyard, finding the church door standing open despite the late hour, well past midnight. Inside, she'd discovered Father O'Malley standing in the center of the nave, his arms spread wide, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle. The bats were flying in circles around him, a living tornado of leathery wings and high-pitched chirping. "Father," she'd called out, but he didn't respond. For several long moments he simply stood there, swaying slightly, the bats flowing around him like water around a stone. Then, all at once, they returned to the rafters, and Father O'Malley collapsed to his knees. When he finally looked at her, Mrs. Kearney said his eyes held no recognition, as if he were looking through her at something far away. He claimed the next morning to have no memory of the incident, suggesting Mrs. Kearney had simply witnessed him in deep prayer. But she noticed he'd worn the same clothes as the night before, and when she collected his cassock for washing, she found it stained with what looked like dried blood around the collar. The third incident involved the children of the parish school. On October 29th, young Brigid Walsh, daughter of the local blacksmith, didn't return home after her lessons. A search party formed immediately, combing through the town and surrounding fields until well after dark. They found her just before midnight, standing in the church cemetery among the ancient Celtic crosses and weathered headstones. She was facing the church, perfectly still, her eyes open but unseeing. When her father shook her shoulder, she seemed to wake from a trance. She had no memory of how she'd gotten there or why she'd remained out past dark, something that terrified her, as she'd always been afraid of the dark. But she did remember a dream, she said, a dream of Father O'Malley calling to her, promising to show her where the angels slept. When her mother undressed her for bed, she found small scratches on Brigid's arms and neck, thin parallel marks that could have been made by brambles or thorns, or perhaps by something with small claws. Over the next 3 days, 4 more children reported similar dreams. They would wake with no memory of sleepwalking, but with the certainty that Father O'Malley had visited them in the night, speaking in whispers about joining the congregation of the faithful, about ascending to where the messengers of God made their home. 2 of these children bore the same mysterious scratches. The parents brought their concerns to Father O'Malley directly on November 1st, All Saints' Day. The meeting, held in the church rectory, grew heated. Patrick Gallagher's diary records the exchange. "We demanded to know if father had been visiting our children in the night. He denied it most vehemently, seemed genuinely disturbed by the suggestion. But when pressed about the dreams, about why they all featured him specifically, he grew pale and retreated into himself. 'The devil can take any form,' he said finally, 'even that of a trusted priest. If something wearing my face comes to your children, it is not me. Lock your doors, say your prayers, and for the love of God, keep them away from the church after dark.'" The villagers left that meeting more frightened than reassured. What did Father O'Malley know that he wasn't sharing? Several men proposed that they investigate the church themselves, but the idea of entering God's house with suspicion in their hearts felt like an additional sin they couldn't bear. So they did what communities have done throughout history when faced with the inexplicable. They rationalized, they prayed, and they convinced themselves that everything would resolve itself. But then came the night of November 2nd. Thomas Brennan, the altar boy who would discover the body the next morning, lived with his family in a cottage on the edge of town. He testified later that he woke shortly after midnight to the sound of beating wings against his window, dozens of bats throwing themselves against the glass panes with enough force to rattle the frame. His father drove them off with a broom, but they simply relocated to the roof, where their scratching and rustling continued until dawn. The Brennan family wasn't alone. Throughout Monaghan Town that night, families reported similar visitations. The bats seemed to be everywhere, far more than the colony from St. Brigid's could account for. They clustered on door frames, hung from shop signs, covered the town square's monument to the fallen of the Napoleonic Wars. Their collective chittering created a sound like whispered conversation in a language no human tongue could form. And in the church, Father Declan O'Malley spent his final hours alone, or so everyone believed at the time. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The events that followed would divide this Irish community and ignite a panic that spread across Ulster like wildfire. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, because what investigators discovered in that church would challenge everything Victorian Ireland believed about the natural world. Let's discover what happens next. Thomas Brennan arrived at St. Brigid's at 6:30 on the morning of November 3rd, as he did every morning to prepare for Mass. The church door stood ajar, unusual but not unprecedented, as Father O'Malley sometimes arrived before dawn to pray. But the moment Thomas stepped inside, he knew something was terribly wrong. The smell hit him first, copper and decay, thick enough to taste. The morning light filtering through the stained glass windows illuminated thousands of motes of dust dancing in the air, and the silence pressed down with an almost physical weight. The bats, usually rustling and chittering in their roosts, hung motionless in the rafters like grotesque fruit. Father O'Malley lay sprawled before the altar, his body positioned as if he'd been reaching toward the tabernacle when he fell. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. Later he would tell investigators that his first thought was that someone had spilled sacramental wine, a ridiculous notion, but his brain grasped for any explanation that made sense. The boy's screams brought shopkeeper Dennis O'Brien running from across the square. O'Brien, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars who'd seen his share of battlefield casualties, took one look at the scene and sent Thomas to fetch the constable and the physician. He then made the decision to stand guard at the door, preventing anyone else from entering until proper authorities arrived. This decision would prove crucial in preserving the crime scene, if crime it was. Dr. James Whitmore arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand, prepared to pronounce death and determine natural causes. Instead, he found himself confronting something that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. His official report, preserved in the Ulster Medical Journal and later referenced in Dr. William Wilde's 1849 Catalogue of Irish Medical Curiosities, provides the most detailed clinical description. The deceased lay supine, his head turned at approximately 45 degrees toward the altar. Rigor mortis had set in completely, suggesting death had occurred between 8 and 12 hours prior to discovery. The ambient temperature of the church, quite cold owing to the stone construction, complicated precise estimation. The subject's complexion presented extreme pallor, beyond what I have observed even in cases of severe anemia or blood loss. The skin possessed a translucent quality, the underlying venous structure clearly visible in the extremities. The lips had taken on a blue-gray coloration. The eyes remained open, the pupils fully dilated, the sclera showing evidence of petechial hemorrhaging suggest either strangulation or extreme terror at the moment of death. Most remarkably, examination of the neck revealed 2 puncture wounds, circular in shape, approximately 7 millimeters in diameter, positioned on the left side of the throat over the carotid artery. The wounds penetrated the dermis and underlying tissue to a depth I estimated at 15 to 20 millimeters. The edges of these wounds showed no tearing or evidence of struggle. They were clean, almost surgical in precision. When I attempted to draw blood for analysis, I found the task nearly impossible. The veins had collapsed completely. The body, though only hours dead, had been drained of blood so thoroughly that standard post-mortem procedures proved ineffective. I have attended to battlefield casualties with more color in their veins than this poor soul possessed. The estimated blood loss exceeded 4 liters, more than half the total volume the human body contains. Yet I found no corresponding blood beneath or around the body. The stone floor, the altar steps, the deceased's clothing, all were remarkably clean except for the staining around the collar of his cassock. Dr. Whitmore's examination was interrupted by a cry from Dennis O'Brien, who had been studying the scene while the doctor worked. O'Brien had noticed something in the rafters, movement where there should be none. Looking up, both men watched as one of the bats detached from its roost and glided down in a silent arc, landing on Father O'Malley's outstretched hand. The bat, later identified by traveling naturalist Edmund Burke as a common pipistrelle, remained motionless on the dead priest's fingers for several long moments. Dr. Whitmore, demonstrating either scientific curiosity or remarkable courage, approached slowly to observe. He noted that the bat's muzzle appeared stained with a dark substance, blood, though he couldn't confirm whether it was fresh or dried. When he reached out to collect the specimen, the entire colony suddenly took flight, filling the church with a maelstrom of wings and high-pitched shrieking that sent both men stumbling toward the exit. Constable William Hughes arrived during this chaos, fighting his way through a tornado of bats to reach the body. A practical man skeptical of superstition, Hughes's first instinct was to look for evidence of human involvement. He noted the absence of signs of struggle. No overturned furniture, no defensive wounds on the deceased's hands, no indication that Father O'Malley had fought his attacker. The church's collection box remained intact, the silver chalices and other valuable items undisturbed, ruling out robbery as a motive. But it was Hughes who made perhaps the most disturbing discovery. On the altar, partially hidden beneath a embroidered cloth, he found Father O'Malley's personal Bible, open to the book of Leviticus. A passage had been circled repeatedly in what appeared to be dried blood. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." Beside the Bible lay a journal, its pages filled with Father O'Malley's increasingly erratic handwriting. The final entries, dated from October 28th through November 2nd, chronicled what appeared to be a descent into either madness or something far more sinister. The priest wrote of voices calling to him in the dark, of an overwhelming thirst he couldn't quench, of dreams where he flew through the night on leather wings, feeding on the warmth of the living. He wrote of fighting against something, an urge, a compulsion, a hunger that grew stronger each night. The final entry, written mere hours before his death, consisted of a single prayer written over and over until the words became illegible scrawls. "Lord, deliver me from this curse. Let me not become the monster they fear. Take my life before I take theirs. The blood, the blood, the blood." The investigation into Father Declan O'Malley's death would become one of the most controversial inquiries in Ulster's history, revealing deep fissures in Irish society and exposing the uncomfortable intersection of faith, superstition, and emerging scientific understanding. Constable Hughes, despite his initial skepticism, found himself navigating a case that defied conventional explanation. Within hours of the discovery, rumors had spread throughout Monaghan Town and into the surrounding countryside. The word on everyone's lips was one that proper Victorian society hesitated to speak aloud. Vampire. Ireland had its own rich tradition of undead folklore, distinct from the Eastern European vampire legends that would later captivate Gothic literature. The Irish Dirgdu, or red bloodsucker, featured in stories dating back to Celtic times, creatures that rose from graves to drain the living, drawn to the warmth and vitality they'd lost. While educated society dismissed such tales as peasant superstition, the folk memory ran deep in rural communities like Monaghan. The Anglican bishop of the diocese, Bishop Richard Mant, arrived in Monaghan on November 4th, accompanied by 2 Protestant clergymen. Despite the religious divide between the Anglican establishment and the Catholic community, Bishop Mant recognized the need for immediate action to prevent panic. He convened an inquest that same evening in the town hall, a proceeding that would last 3 days, and hear testimony from over 40 witnesses. The medical evidence presented by Dr. Whitmore created immediate controversy. When he described the complete exsanguination of the body and the precise nature of the neck wounds, several members of the jury, all Protestant landowners as was standard practice, exchanged meaningful glances. The jury foreman, Lord Edward Richardson, interrupted the doctor's testimony to ask the question everyone was thinking. Doctor, in your professional opinion, could these wounds have been made by an animal bite? Specifically, could they have been made by bats? Dr. Whitmore's response, recorded in the inquest proceedings, was carefully measured. The common bat species found in Ireland possess teeth too small to create wounds of this size. However, there exist in other parts of the world species of larger bats that do feed on blood, the vampire bats of South America, for instance, though these have never been documented in Europe. The wounds are consistent with a feeding mechanism designed to access major blood vessels, but I cannot state definitively whether they were made by animal or human agency, or indeed by something combining characteristics of both. This ambiguous answer satisfied no one and inflamed everyone. The Catholic community, already suspicious of the Protestant-dominated inquest, began to see the proceedings as an attack on their faith. Father Michael Corrigan, who had been rushed from a neighboring parish to serve St. Brigid's congregation, testified that Father O'Malley had been a devout priest who could not possibly have engaged in any unholy practices. He pointed to the Bible passage and the desperate final prayers as evidence that Father O'Malley had been fighting against some evil force, not succumbing to one. But testimony from the parishioners painted a more complex picture. Mrs. Kearney, weeping throughout her testimony, described the progressive changes in Father O'Malley's behavior. Patrick Gallagher read excerpts from his diary documenting the priest's increasingly erratic conduct. The parents of the children who'd experienced the strange dreams and subsequent injuries provided accounts that, taken together, suggested a pattern of nocturnal visitations that coincided with Father O'Malley's own nighttime wanderings. The most damning testimony came from Edmund Burke, the naturalist who had been studying bat populations in Ulster. Burke had arrived in Monaghan 2 weeks before the priest's death to investigate reports of unusual bat behavior. He testified that the colony at St. Brigid's had grown from approximately 15 individuals in early October to well over 300 by November, an unprecedented population explosion that defied natural behavioral patterns. Bats are colonial animals, Burke explained, but they establish their roosts seasonally and maintain relatively stable populations. The sudden influx at St. Brigid's suggested either displacement from another roost or attraction to some specific condition within the church. I visited the church on October 30th and requested permission to study the colony, but Father O'Malley refused, becoming quite agitated at the suggestion. He claimed the bats were under his protection and that I would not be permitted to disturb them. Burke also provided disturbing analysis of the bat specimens he'd collected from the church after Father O'Malley's death. Of the 15 bats he examined, 12 showed traces of human blood in their digestive systems. While he acknowledged that bats might occasionally feed on small amounts of human blood if given access to wounds, the quantity detected was inconsistent with opportunistic feeding and suggested prolonged and repeated access to a reliable blood source. The inquest took a dramatic turn on its third day, when young Brigid Walsh, the blacksmith's daughter, testified. The 11-year-old girl described her trance-like episode in the cemetery with such vivid detail that it left the chamber silent. But it was her response to a question from Lord Richardson that shocked everyone presé. "Did you feel afraid of Father O'Malley during these dreams?" Richardson asked. "No, sir," Brigid replied, her voice small but clear. "I felt sorry for him. He was crying. He kept saying he was so hungry, but he didn't want to be hungry anymore. He showed me his teeth and they were different, longer. He said he was becoming something terrible and he was trying to stop it, but every night it got harder to remember why he should." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Several Catholic parishioners accused Richardson of coaching the child. Protestant observers pointed to the testimony as confirmation of their darkest suspicions. Bishop Mant called for order, but the proceedings effectively ended there. The jury retired to deliberate, returning after less than an hour with a verdict that pleased no one and satisfied everyone's worst fears. "We find that Father Declan O'Malley died as a result of extreme blood loss caused by means unknown. We cannot rule out the possibility of death by misadventure involving the bat colony resident in St. Brigid's Church. We recommend the immediate extermination of said colony and the sealing of the church, until it can be properly consecrated by appropriate religious authorities." The verdict's carefully neutral language did nothing to quell the rising panic. The question of what, exactly, Father O'Malley had become, or what had been done to him, remained unanswered. The Catholic community viewed the verdict as a Protestant attack on their faith, an attempt to paint their priest as a monster. The Protestant establishment saw it as a dangerous concession to superstition that threatened to undermine rational inquiry. The aftermath proved nearly as tragic as the death itself. On November 6th, 3 days after the inquest's conclusion, a mob of nearly 100 men, both Protestant and Catholic, descended on St. Brigid's church. Armed with torches, axes, and rifles, they were determined to destroy the bat colony before it could claim more victims. What followed was described by witnesses as a scene from hell itself. The men barricaded the church doors and windows, then used long poles to destroy the roosting sites in the rafters. The bats, driven into a frenzy, attacked en masse. Several men suffered bites and scratches before the decision was made to simply burn the creatures out. Fires were lit in metal braziers and brought inside. The smoke meant to drive the bats toward the exits where men waited with clubs and nets. But the old wood of the rafters caught fire faster than expected. Within minutes, the interior of St. Brigid's was an inferno. The men barely escaped before the roof collapsed, sending a column of sparks and smoke hundreds of feet into the November sky. The church, which had stood for over 2 centuries, burned throughout the night and into the next day. When the fires finally died, only the stone walls remained standing, blackened, cracked, and open to the sky. 2 men died in the fire, suffocated by smoke while trying to save the church's historic artifacts. Dozens more suffered burns and injuries. And when workers finally began clearing the debris weeks later, they found the charred remains of hundreds of bats, but they also found something else that was never officially recorded in any report. In the church's crypt, accessible only through a trapdoor beneath where the altar had stood, workers discovered a sealed chamber that hadn't appeared on any architectural plans. Inside, they found evidence that someone had been living there: a makeshift bed, candles burned down to stubs, and disturbing scratches covering the walls. The scratches formed words, repeated over and over in increasingly frantic scrawls. "Keep me here, don't let me out. I am not myself when the sun sets, chain me down, let me die here, don't become like me." This discovery was suppressed by both religious and civil authorities, who agreed that public knowledge would only inflame tensions further. The workers were sworn to secrecy, though of course rumors leaked out, adding yet another layer to the growing legend of the Monaghan church bats. Father O'Malley's body had been buried in the church cemetery on November 5th, but the grave was desecrated the following night by persons unknown. When constables investigated the next morning, they found the grave had been dug up and a wooden stake driven through the coffin, a traditional method for ensuring the dead remained dead. The coffin was resealed and reburied, this time in an unmarked location to prevent further interference. The official church response was swift and unequivocal. The Catholic Diocese of Clogher issued a statement condemning pagan superstitions and affirming that Father O'Malley had died in the service of God, a victim of unknown causes. They announced that St. Brigid's would not be rebuilt, and the parish would be consolidated with neighboring congregations. The Protestant establishment, meanwhile, used the incident as evidence that Catholic priests wielded undue influence over their superstitious flocks, and that rational, scientific governance was necessary to prevent such outbreaks of mass hysteria. The legal ramifications were complex. No criminal charges were ever filed in Father O'Malley's death. How could they be, when the cause remained officially undetermined? However, several civil suits emerged. The families of the 2 men who died in the church fire sued both the local magistrate and the church authorities for failing to properly secure the building. These suits were quietly settled out of court. Mrs. Kearney, Father O'Malley's housekeeper, filed a claim for lost wages and emotional distress, which was also settled privately. But perhaps the most significant legal development came in the form of the Public Health Ireland Act of 1846, which included provisions for the management of pest species in religious and public buildings. While ostensibly about sanitation and disease prevention, historians recognize this legislation as a direct response to the Monaghan incident, establishing procedures for handling infestations while avoiding the kind of mob action that had destroyed St. Brigid's. In the months following the fire, several similar incidents emerged across Ulster and beyond. In County Down, a parish priest reported being tormented by nightmares and an unnatural thirst before seeking help from his bishop. In County Fermanagh, a church sexton discovered bite marks on his neck after falling asleep in the bell tower where bats roosted. In Cork, parishioners complained that their priest had become nocturnal, conducting services only after sunset, and refusing to venture outside during daylight hours. Each case was handled quietly by church authorities, resulting in transfers, early retirements, or commitments to asylums. The pattern suggested that whatever had afflicted Father O'Malley was neither unique nor isolated, but the conspiracy of silence maintained by both Catholic and Protestant establishments ensured these cases never received public attention. The Monaghan church bats incident occurred at a pivotal moment in Irish history, and its ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. To understand its lasting impact, we must consider both the immediate social consequences and the broader shifts in how Victorian society approached the intersection of faith, science, and folklore. The destruction of St. Brigid's Church marked a turning point in religious relations in Ulster. The incident exposed the raw sectarian tensions that would continue to plague Ireland for over a century. Protestant observers used the case to argue that Catholic superstition had led directly to violence and destruction, citing the mob burning as evidence of the irrationality they attributed to the Irish Catholic population. Catholic communities, meanwhile, viewed the investigation and its aftermath as yet another instance of Protestant authorities refusing to fairly examine crimes against Catholic clergy while simultaneously exploiting the tragedy to advance anti-Catholic narratives. But beneath these political machinations, the incident fundamentally altered how rural Irish communities related to their churches and clergy. Parish records from across Ulster show a marked increase in parishioners requesting that priests undergo regular health examinations, that churches be better maintained and lit, and that bat infestations be promptly addressed. Several parishes established committees of lay members to assist their priests with administrative duties, a development that some church historians interpret as a polite form of surveillance, ensuring that no priest could isolate himself the way Father O'Malley had. The medical implications proved equally significant. Dr. Whitmore's report caught the attention of the Dublin Pathological Society, which commissioned a study of similar cases involving extreme blood loss. This research, published in 1847 as Unusual Presentations of Hemorrhagic Death in Rural Populations, examined 12 cases across Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, where victims had died with symptoms similar to Father O'Malley's. While the authors stopped short of endorsing supernatural explanations, they acknowledged that conventional medical understanding could not adequately account for the complete exsanguination observed in these cases. The study's publication coincided with growing interest in the emerging field of hematology, the study of blood and blood-related disorders. Dr. William Wilde, father of the famous Oscar Wilde, referenced the Monaghan case in his 1849 work on Irish epidemiology, noting that severe anemia combined with psychological disturbance might explain some historical vampire legends. This early attempt to medicalize supernatural folklore represented an important step in Victorian science's ongoing effort to rationalize the inexplicable. Naturalist Edmund Burke continued his bat research in the wake of the Monaghan incident, eventually publishing an account of the Chiroptera of Ulster in 1851. His work documented the first cases of rabies in Irish bat populations, a finding that provided a partial scientific explanation for aggressive bat behavior and the transmission of disease through bites. While rabies couldn't explain the systematic blood loss or the precise nature of Father O'Malley's wounds, it offered a framework for understanding how bat exposure might lead to neurological symptoms, behavioral changes, and eventual death. Burke's research also documented something he called mass roost attraction, situations where bat populations would suddenly converge on a single location in numbers far exceeding normal colony sizes. While he couldn't definitively explain what triggered these events, he speculated that chemical signals from diseased or dying bats might attract others, creating dangerous concentrations of potentially infected animals. This theory, while not entirely accurate by modern standards, represented an early attempt to apply ecological principles to unexplained phenomena. The incident's impact on Irish folklore and literature proved profound and lasting. The Monaghan church bats became a staple of local legend, told and retold around firesides throughout Ulster. The story evolved with each telling. Some versions portrayed Father O'Malley as a tragic victim of demonic possession, others as a man who made dark bargains in desperate times, and still others as a saint who sacrificed himself to contain an evil that might otherwise have consumed his entire congregation. When Bram Stoker, an Irishman himself, published Dracula in 1897, literary scholars noted clear parallels to the Monaghan incident. Stoker's portrayal of the vampire as a sophisticated figure capable of controlling lesser creatures, his emphasis on the spiritual dimensions of vampirism, and his treatment of the vampire's victims as tortured souls fighting against their transformat. All echo elements of Father O'Malley's story. While Stoker never explicitly acknowledged the connection, he would have been familiar with the case through Irish oral tradition and through newspaper archives he consulted while researching his novel. The psychological implications of the case resonated through the emerging field of psychiatry. In the 1850s and 1860s, alienists, the Victorian term for mental health specialists, began documenting cases of sanguinary delusion, a condition where patients believed they needed to consume blood to survive. While these cases were typically attributed to various forms of psychosis, the medical literature began referencing the Monaghan incident as a historical example of how religious isolation, poor nutrition, and environmental factors might combine to produce severe psychological breaks from reality. Dr. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, in his controversial 1886 work Psychopathia Sexualis, included a chapter on hematomania that cited the Monaghan case alongside several other European incidents. While much of Krafft-Ebing's work has been discredited by modern psychology, his attempt to create a taxonomy of unusual psychological conditions represented an important step in moving supernatural explanations toward medical frameworks. The case also influenced architectural practices for religious buildings. After 1845, church construction guidelines in Ireland began including specific provisions for preventing bat infestations, proper ventilation, screens on openings, regular maintenance schedules, and recommendations that clergy not work alone in churches after dark. These practical measures, born from tragedy, became standard practice and likely prevented similar incidents from occurring. Perhaps most significantly, the Monaghan church bats incident contributed to a broader shift in how Western society approached the unknown. The mid-19th century represented a transitional period when traditional folklore and emerging scientific rationalism existed in tense coexistence. Cases like Father O'Malley's death forced communities to confront the limits of both systems of knowledge. Superstition offered explanations but no solutions, while science provided frameworks but couldn't account for all observed phenomena. This tension would gradually resolve in favor of scientific materialism, but not without cost. The dismissal of folk knowledge sometimes meant discarding accurate observations, simply because they came wrapped in supernatural language. Modern researchers studying historical vampire cases have found that many described real medical conditions, porphyria, rabies, catalepsy, tuberculosis, that produced symptoms that terrified pre-modern observers who had no framework for understanding them. The Monaghan case also reveals something uncomfortable about how communities respond to tragedy. The need to assign blame, to create clear narratives of good versus evil, led to the destruction of a historic church and the demonization of a man who may have been more victim than perpetrator. The sectarian tensions that the case inflamed would persist for over a century, contributing to the cycles of violence that plagued Northern Ireland well into the 20th century. In the end, what happened to Father Declan O'Malley remains a mystery. Modern skeptics point to the combination of poor nutrition during the famine, possible rabies exposure, religious mania, and confirmation bias as explaining most aspects of the case. The unexplained elements, the complete exsanguination, the precise wounds, the documented behavioral changes in multiple witnesses, might be attributable to exaggeration, poor record-keeping, or mass hysteria. Yet the documentary evidence persists, carefully preserved in medical journals, court records, and church archives. Something happened in St. Brigid's Church in the autumn of 1845, something that so terrified the people of Monaghan that they burned their own place of worship to the ground wraith. Then risk it happening again. What do you think really happened to Father Declan O'Malley in those final nights? Was he the victim of a rare medical condition amplified by famine and fear? Did he encounter something in that old church that medical science of his time, or perhaps even ours, couldn't explain? Or did the isolation of his position, combined with the apocalyptic atmosphere of pre-famine Ireland, drive him to a psychological break that manifested in the very symbols of vampirism that his culture provided? Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you believe there was a natural explanation for the complete blood loss? Could rabies account for all the observed symptoms? Or do some historical mysteries resist rational explanation no matter how hard we try to impose one? The ruins of St. Brigid still stand in Monaghan, though a new Catholic church was built on a different site in 1867. Local residents report that even now, bats avoid the blackened stone walls, and no birds nest in the remaining tower. Whether that's ecological coincidence or something more, I'll leave you to decide. Subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost chapters of history where faith, fear, and the inexplicable collide. We dive deep into the stories that history textbooks prefer to forget, bringing you the documented truth that's often stranger and darker than fiction. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share this story with anyone who appreciates the mysteries that hide in the margins of history. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that leave behind official records. Until next time, I'm the Silent Abbey, and I'll see you in the shadows of the past. Create a cohesive narrative. The case of the Monaghan church bats represents a composite of several historical incidents involving unexplained deaths, bat infestations, and vampire folklore in 19th century Ireland. Viewer discretion is advised,